Okay, picture this. You've got a guy sitting in the absolute lap of luxury, right? He's chilling in this magnificent winter palace, completely surrounded by wealth, safety, and just immense political power. But meanwhile, 800 miles away, the city of his ancestors is sitting in absolute ruins. We're talking demolished walls, gates literally burned to ash, and the people still living there, they are suffering terribly. So this man has a choice to make. Does he actually care? Or does he just, pour himself another cup of wine and go back to his very comfortable life? Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking the anatomy of a calling. We're going to look at a genuinely fascinating historical text, the very first chapter of the Book of Nehemiah. Guys, this is basically a masterclass in how a profound sense of purpose actually takes root in a person's life. To really grasp why this matters, we have to look at the timeline. So back in 538 BC, the very first group of exiles returned to Jerusalem. Then, jump to 516 BC, the temple gets rebuilt. Now we find ourselves in 445 BC. It's the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, and our guy Nehemiah is hanging out in Susa. Now, why does this specific math matter? Well, because the actual destruction of Jerusalem's walls happened way back in 586 BC. Let that sink in. That means in 445 BC, those ruined walls were a 140-year-old reality. The devastation of Jerusalem absolutely was not breaking news to anyone in the Persian Empire. I mean, the people had been back home for almost 100 years at this point. And you just have to notice the stark, frankly jarring contrast between these two worlds. On one side, we have Susa. It's the Winter Palace. It's the absolute epicenter of the Persian Empire. Nehemiah is living there. And get this, he isn't some struggling refugee. No, he is a highly successful, incredibly prestigious official. He is perfectly safe. But on the other side, we have Jerusalem, 800 miles away. It's just a scene of utter devastation where the remnant of his people are living in total distress and reproach. Now, human nature tells us that distance usually breeds apathy, right? The physical distance of 800 miles was vast, for sure, but the real distance was whether this comfortable man's heart was actually willing to be disturbed by a faraway tragedy. Okay, let's dive right into this. Step 1, the courage to ask. This brings us to Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. So how does a calling actually begin? Interestingly, it starts with a completely voluntary action. Verse 2 tells us that Nehemiah's brother Hanani and a few other guys arrived from Judah. And Nehemiah says, I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped and concerning Jerusalem. So the absolute crucial point here is that he chose to ask. As a high-ranking official, he really didn't have to do that. He could have just politely greeted his brother, bought the guys a nice dinner, and sent them on their merry way. He literally had 100 reasons not to ask about some ruined city 800 miles away. Why? Because asking brings a really dangerous risk. Once you know something, you might actually have to take responsibility for it. And that brings us to the super profound realization. God's call rarely makes your life more convenient. It makes your life have more weight. Just think about that for a second. The news Nehemiah received, it didn't solve a single one of his problems. Actually, scratch that. It only brought him trouble. We're talking immense risks, a perilous journey, political enemies, and literal months of waiting. Honestly, so many of us never discover a profound calling simply because, we keep our ears closed. We completely refuse to ask the hard questions about the brokenness around us just because we prefer the convenience of our own safe little Susa. Which leads us to step 2, cry before planning. Once Nehemiah gets the bad news, his reaction completely dismantles our modern obsession with immediate, relentless action. Just look at this sequence of events. Step 1, he hears the news. Step 2, he sits down and just weeps, literally mourning for days. Step 3, he fasts and prays. It is only in step 4 that he finally takes action. Now, if you know the rest of the story, Nehemiah is actually one of the most masterful project managers in all of history. He eventually goes to Jerusalem, organizes all the people, manages the logistics, handles the finances, and rebuilds the entire city wall in just 52 days. I mean, the guy is a born executor. But this master planner, he didn't start with blueprints or spreadsheets or some big strategy meeting. He started with tears. We have such a tendency today to just jump straight from step 1 to step 4. We hear about a problem, and immediately we're like, let's form a committee, draft a plan, let's get to work. But as you can see, action without tears is just impulse, it's not a calling. When you rush into action without first being deeply burdened, without actually weeping over the reality of the brokenness, you end up building a project with absolutely no roots. Sure, it might look super busy and exciting at first, but because it lacks a deep spiritual burden, it will absolutely crumble the second it faces any real mockery or serious threats. The incredible execution we see later in this story, it was entirely grown from the soil of those initial tears. The order absolutely matters.
All right, moving on to step 3, the perfect prayer. Let's look at Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 5 through 11.
So after the tears comes the prayer. And this is widely considered one of the most beautifully structured templates for seeking intervention you will ever read. Let's break down its structural beauty for a second. It moves through 4 really distinct phases. First, he focuses on God's attributes. He begins by acknowledging the great and awesome God, basically starting with who God is rather than immediately rushing in with his own frantic needs. Second, he moves to confession. Third, he recalls God's promises. And then finally, fourth, he makes his specific petition. It is just an absolute masterclass in perspective. But I want to draw your attention to a really fascinating detail in that second step, the confession. Nehemiah says, "I confess the sins of the children of Israel. Both my father's house and I have sinned." Did you catch the pronoun there? He says we, not they. Remember, Nehemiah was born in captivity. He didn't personally tear down those walls 140 years ago. Yet he takes complete ownership of the sins of a generation he wasn't even part of. This brilliantly illustrates the true, humble posture of an intercessor. He is standing inside the failure of his people. He's not pointing a finger from above it. Then we get to step 3, and wow, this is where the real power lies. Nehemiah actually quotes the Book of Deuteronomy right back to God. He reminds God of the promise made to Moses, that if the people return to him, he will gather them back even from the farthest parts of the heavens. Now, Nehemiah isn't quoting this because he thinks God somehow had a lapse of memory and forgot his own word. No, he does it to firmly anchor, to literally nail his own urgent, desperate petition directly to the promises God has already spoken. And guys, that is the secret to a confident prayer. It rests on what has already been guaranteed, not just on how loudly you can ask for it.
And that brings us to the pivot, the cup in your hand.
All of this grief, the fasting, this beautifully structured prayer, it has all been building to a massive pivot. And it hinges on an incredibly short, sudden sentence at the very end of verse 11. Nehemiah ends his intense prayer by asking God to grant him favor in the sight of this man. Now, this man refers to the most powerful monarch in the world, the Persian king. And then the text just drops this totally cinematic realization right on us. I was the king's cupbearer. Just think about the weight of that for a second. The man kneeling on the floor, begging God to move the heart of the king, realizes he is the exact person who stands right beside the king every single day, tasting his wine and holding his total trust. He was the answer to his own prayer. Now, this is where the story gets incredibly personal for us. You see, Nehemiah didn't become the cupbearer so he could one day rebuild a wall. He was literally just doing his job, but God used his exact position as the open door. Look at your own life right now. Your current job, your current identity, your everyday resources. These things might seem completely unrelated to some grand purpose, but God has already placed resources right in your hands. You do not need to see the entire master plan or the 52-day project schedule before you kneel to pray. You just need to kneel, and God will reveal what is already right there in your hand. So we're going to end with this. Nehemiah's incredible legacy started simply because he dared to ask a question. He allowed his heart to be broken, and he finally realized he was perfectly positioned to act. You know, the world is full of broken walls today. Poverty, broken families, systemic injustices. You aren't called to fix all of them. God assigns different walls to different people. But the anatomy of your calling, it starts right here. I'm going to leave you with this question to chew on. Which ruined wall makes you weep the moment you hear of it? Find that, and you might just find exactly what you were put here to rebuild. Thanks so much for joining me on today's Explainer. I'll see you next time.